So while working directly with the axes inside of Unity is helpful and really good for quick demos, what we really need to do is come up with a better way of abstracting the relationship between our game objects and the input that they receive. One of the ways that we're going to be able to do this is by actually mapping all input that's received in the game to a special set of enums. These enums are going to be simple button references such as up, down, left, right, A, B, select, start, all the things that you'd normally associate with game input. Then, on the other end, we'll write a class that will accept all the input that comes in from Unity and map them to these buttons. To get started, we're going to create an input manager. Inside of our script folder, let's create a new C# class called input manager. And this will be our own custom input manager. Next, we're going to need to create an enum class. We're going to do this above the input manager so that it's accessible throughout the scope of the code. So here, we'll make it a public enum called buttons. An enum is almost like a list of values. Any property we put in here will relate to an ID, such as 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on, based on each of the strings that we type in. So a value of right is going to be 0, and a value of left is going to be 1. The good thing about enums in our code is that it allows us to do type-safe value checks. So instead of having to remember the actual ID of a button, we can simply test against buttons.right or buttons.left, and then make sure that we don't have errors on our own code and everything passes the compiler. Next, before we actually start putting code in our input manager, we're going to need to create another class. We're going to make this a public class outside of input manager, and we can have multiple classes and public enums all in the same script. In this case, we want to create a class called input axis state. We're going to make it a public class, and we'll name it input axis state. Next, we'll have to close off the class. Now, an input axis state is going to do sort of what it sounds like. We're going to record the state value of a particular axis inside of Unity's own input manager. We'll be able to take that state and interpret what the value of it is and what button it actually maps over to. The reason we're actually making it its own class is that we're going to keep an array of these inside of our input manager. But one thing we'll need to do is let Unity know that these are actually serializable objects. By default, you extend mono behavior, which is a serializable object and can be saved by the IDE. In this case, we're going to need to tell it manually. So let's add a bracket and pull in the system namespace serializable. Now, whenever we make changes to this inside of Unity, the IDE itself will actually save those values out for us. This will make a little bit more sense as we go further along. Now, inside of this state, we want to keep track of a few values. The first is going to be a public string, and this is the actual axis name that it will map to. As an example, we'll make the first input axis state be horizontal. Next, we need to keep track of what that value of the state actually is. So we're going to create a float, and we're going to call this the off value. Remember, axis values return to 0 when they're off. So for now, all we need to know is what the default off value is for an axis. And finally, we're going to need to map the axis from Unity's input manager over to our button enum. In this case, we're going to create a new public enum called buttons, and we'll just call this button. And now, in order to make sure this works, we're going to need to create an array of input axis states. So inside of our input manager, let's create a public array. Here, we'll type it to input axis state, we'll make it an array, and we'll call this inputs. We'll save our script, and let's go back into Unity. Now, in order for our input manager to work, we're actually going to need to attach it to another game object. So in this case, let's attach the input manager to an empty game object. Go to the game object menu, create empty, and let's call this input manager. Then we'll drag the input manager script onto the input game object, and you'll see now that we have an array of inputs. If we were to set this to 1, you'll see that we get an element. And in this element, we now have an axis name, an auth value, and a button. Going back into our scripts, you'll see that that maps directly to the input state we created. This is a really good technique inside of Unity for creating more complex properties and having them exposed inside of the IDE. Remember, whenever you create custom classes like this, you need to make sure that they're serializable so that Unity knows how to save them out when you're done making changes. In this case, we can change this element to be horizontal. Its auth value is going to be 0, and we're going to map it to a button right. Now that we have this simple state, we can start looking into how to actually take advantage of it and read input and map the two together from the custom input manager to Unity's input manager and our new button enums.